We're back. Week 10, the final week of content.
Yeah.
How did we get here?
And how will we ever leave?
I'm really looking forward to our workshop weeks in week 11 and 12, but I'm also interested in the conversation we're going to have about this on Tuesday, the 21st of November. So we have two pieces that we're looking at this week, and one of them is very, very transparent and clear. It's Vincent Bevan's article in long read article in The Guardian, "The Mass Protest Decade, Why Did the Street Movements of the 2010s Fail?" And then we also have Jody Dean's section from Jody Dean's book, Crowds and Party. And both of these texts address the limits, some might even say the failures, of the kind of cycle of protests that kicked off in around 2010 in the wake of the great financial crisis. Some might say they're even a critique of a cycle of protests that began in the late 90s with the battle in Seattle and the kind of anarchist horizontalist turn in social movements. Both of the authors are skeptics towards these movements and their possibilities, and are trying to encourage us to move in other directions. I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I feel, for my own part, I came of age in the late 90s and early 2000s. And my theoretical work and a lot of my activist work has been dedicated towards horizontalist organizing. So I'm excited to challenge and provoke it.
Yeah, and I'm a baby comparatively. No kidding. I did not come of age then. I actually came of age right when Occupy happened, if you think about it, because I'm 32. So Occupy happened when I was a sophomore in university. And I remember my best friend writing me, who's still my best friend, and being like, maybe this is it. Like, like maybe this is the revolution. And I don't think that was actually particularly naive. I think that everyone has that moment in their life organizing where, like, I don't know, everyone is coalescing in Wall Street. That seems huge. And it was there for months. And so, yeah, I really relate to both of these readings from the perspective almost of like, I can't actually imagine activism prior to them. Because, of course, even if you're involved as a child in something your parents think is a good idea or whatever, it's not the same moment in your formative thinking or whatever. And I think also the second layer to this for me is that although I was certainly supportive of the Occupy movements, but I wasn't incredibly involved. I was doing other stuff. I was doing like prison teaching and just other things. But I was very involved in a large mutual aid network that is still a little bit going slowly in the background in North London during COVID. That was started on a WhatsApp thread, day 2 of the like COVID lockdown. And, at one point it had 450 people all registered to help. And then they, for a ward of 15,000 people. And I spent tons of time doing that thing, and that thing is a thing that sounds like it is horizontal, but as we shall discuss, was maybe not necessarily in a bad way, quickly made less horizontal in order for everyone to be sane. And I think that's an interesting thing to reflect on too.
Yeah. Maybe I think the Vincent Bevan's piece that folks are reading really speaks for itself, and we'll touch on the themes, but I thought maybe I would tell a little bit more of an extended story of my own intergenerational political upbringing, which I think at very least it explains why I'm interested in this topic, and at best it illuminates a bunch of twists and turns of the left over the late 20th and early 21st centuries. I don't know. I mean, my experience is in Canada. I think there's a lot of things that people outside of Canada, especially in the US and UK, would find resonant. Beyond that, I wonder. But I mean, the folks will have read in the Vincent Bevan's piece about the Students for a Democratic Society. And if you just read the excerpts, basically Bevan sort of traces the origins of horizontalism to SDS and the so-called New Left, which emerged in the 1960s with the baby boomer generation emerging to become sort of university aged. And it's important to remember that, in the North Atlantic, this was a generation where an unprecedented number of young people were going to university because of the alleged transition of the economy towards kind of what today we would call a knowledge economy. And that meant that youth really felt like they were a key constituency, not just that they were workers or students, but actually that young people should rebel. But that moment in the late 60s and early 70s was really defined against a kind of old left. What's the new, for there to be a new left, there had to be an old left. And the old left in this case was people who'd been aligned with communist or socialist parties in a very rigid kind of late 19th, early 20th century way. Like you got a card and you belonged to the party, and the party had elected officials or even appointed officials. And then you kind of your role in the revolution was to kind of do what the party told you to do, in a certain sense. And there was a kind of hierarchy. And a lot of this was based either on social democratic ideals, that you're supposed to have what we would recognize today as a political party that runs elections, and it has staff people and it has elected officials, and you do blah blah blah. Or so on one hand you have the social democratic party of the old left, and on the other side of the old left, from the late 19th, early 20th century, you have the revolutionary party, usually modeled on the thought of Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, not really the leader, but the leader of the Bolshevik party, which took over the Russian Revolution in 1917. And Lenin believed that you needed to have an incredibly disciplined group of highly trained professional organizers who had a unified party line, who would be able to move extremely quickly and capitalize on a revolutionary situation, which is exactly what they did during the Russian Revolution. They all streamed back from exile into Russia. And basically, when everything was in complete chaos because of all of these mobilizations and occupations and such, Lenin's party, under Lenin as the leader, was able to basically seize power, outmaneuver, and even kill their left-wing opponents, and become, found the USSR, essentially. And I think that for the New Left, which was my parents' generation, they were very skeptical of these old left tactics for all sorts of reasons. I think initially those, in the late 60s and early 70s, those tactics sort of smelled of authoritarianism. Already in 1956, the USSR had invaded Hungary. In 1968, the USSR basically invaded Czechoslovakia to overthrow governments that were seeking different kinds of socialism. They weren't, okay, we can have a debate about exactly who were in the Hungarian and Czech rebellions, but that suffice to say, these were rebellions that, at least on the surface, appeared to most people to be just demanding what in Hungary they called socialism with a human face. And so the sort of Soviet Union had sort of shown that it was a kind of very repressive state by that time, and a lot of the left lost faith in it. Others had lost faith in it because of the role of Stalin in the Spanish Civil War and repressing anarchist movements. So by the 60s, I think there was a lot of skepticism among the New Left towards these parties. Also because by that time, many of the parties, socialist and communist parties, had sort of made their peace with capitalism and been well, we're just going to kind of play the capitalist game. We're going to be an elected party. We're going to kind of fight for old traditional unions and workers, but that there was not really a sense of revolutionary vision. So you had this movement towards the New Left, which initially I think my parents were part of, which was sort of rejecting these top-down doctrinaire forms of organization, and instead pushing for a kind of what gets termed in the 90s and 2000s horizontalist structure. So rather than having a vertical hierarchical structure, you have a kind of commonality of equals. This really drew on feminist, what would later be identified as sort of feminist and anarchist principles. That suggests that in social movements, you not only need to challenge the outward faces of power, you also need to challenge power as it expresses itself through you, through your relationships, through your organizations. But my parents were also part of what was called an anti-revisionist turn after the New Left. So starting by the 1970s, a lot of the New Left had been a major, like, had been seen to be a failure, especially around on being unable to stop the Vietnam War, of never being able to get above a certain kind of threshold of popularity. Like, it was pretty clear certainly by the mid 1970s, that the thing called the New Left was never going to really, like, the Students for Democratic Society were not going to have a revolution in the United States of America, or in Canada, where my parents were from, or in the UK. And so you began to see many, many people on the left turn even more left in certain ways, often inspired by Maoism, or Cuban communism, which were seen as these kind of like non-Western forms of socialism. And my parents were a part of a kind of Maoist militant group that went back to the writings of Lenin and other kind of that generation, and were like, no, we're against the New Left. We're against the horizontalist, what now we would call the horizontalist turn. We actually want to go back and have rigid party discipline and doctrine, because that's the way that you actually organize people. And my parents were part of some of those groups where people dropped out of university, including my parents, to go and organize in like factories, because the party told them to do that. And so I always grew up, and then I should say by the late 1970s, just before I was born, their group collapsed inward on itself for reasons that would not surprise many of the people in our course who are of the more horizontalist framing. It had to do with really super, super toxic interpersonal relationships that could never be questioned within the hierarchy of the group. The leader was exploiting and being a horrible person and doing purges and obsessed with his own power, all of the things that we're familiar with from left-wing organizations and cults. And it basically destroyed the organization, or the organization essentially schismed into a million different organizations. And there was great heartbreak. And from that, I was born. That's my origin story. No, and then I think I grew up in a household where my parents continued to be activists. They're still activists today, and I really love them, and I'm very proud of them, and they set a great example. But I grew up in a household where a lot of those, like, I would say, like, Leninist principles, those like old left verticalist principles, were very instilled. A spirit of self-sacrifice, a spirit of just like working to your limit for social change, like not resting, a spirit that didn't have a lot of space for weakness, and not a lot of space for emotions. I grew up, even when I started organizing myself, based on what I'd learned from my parents, who are no longer part of these organizations, but sort of brought this spirit forward, was like very much like you're at work, you're at work for the future, you're at work for the revolution. And you got to be like disciplined and dedicated. And, I think probably a lot of people in our course are like, my God, that sounds awful. There's also parts of it that are great. And I'm very, as I said, like, I love my parents. I'm very proud of them. I think they're great people. I think they've done more than for like other human beings than most people I know. And I continue to be inspired, and I've like learned a lot from them. But for me, when I sort of came of age, like I started organizing when I was very young, when I was like an early teenager. But by the time I was about 18 or 19, I was like, I kind of want something different. And I became very interested in this next wave of kind of horizontalist organizing, which was associated with the altered globalization movement, the battle in Seattle, these sorts of moments of kind of going and confronting the forces of capitalist globalization at summits through combative tactics. But that was also done through the way that we organized as well, which was completely non-hierarchical, not completely, but like largely and explicitly anti-hierarchical. Based on very explicit feminist principles that rejected authority and certain models of leadership and hierarchy. And a lot of my work that I did as a scholar and an activist was also based on reinforcing that. So my book on the radical imagination is very much inspired by horizontalist principles and thinking through movements that use those and espouse those. And a lot of my public writing has been sort of dedicated to these things. And it's the way in which still to this day, the way that I organize. I organize in community, grassroots initiatives that are horizontal, participatory, democratic, and are working at the level of like usually around mutual aid and kind of like the idea that your movements also should cultivate the people who are in them so that we can distribute leadership to everyone. I think in that context, I was also part of the generation that was there being inspiring to people, maybe closer to your generation, Sarah, who then went on to do things like the Occupy movement in the Americas and North Atlantic and other movements. And, you know, just briefly to say that, we think the Occupy movement just kind of sprang up from nowhere, but that's in fact not quite the case. There were a bunch of people who'd sort of either been part of anarchist and feminist movements in New York City for many years, or who'd sort of cut their teeth in the ultra-globalization movement, who were literally there teaching people how to do the assemblies and how to set up a camp and how to make democratic decisions and how to do this technique called the people's microphone and things like that. Including famously David Graeber, the theorist, was there, and a number of other quite prominent people, all of whom, were really inspired by this horizontalist ethos. So now we fast forward to 10 years after the Occupy movement and Vincent Bevan's kind of key question here, which is a question being asked by many, many people, including many people of my generation, let's say, and I think of your generation, who are sort of questioning, like, what went wrong? Like, why didn't, like, if we look back over the 10 years, things actually in almost every context have just gotten way worse. And there's been a kind of reaction against the horizontalist turn on many parts of the left, to say, well, maybe we need to go back to a much more vertical form of organization that kind of takes what we can learn from either social democratic parties, which, you know, try and win elections and kind of kick the ball forward that way, or from Leninism and revolutionary parties, which is definitely where Jody Dean is sort of coming from. And I don't think anyone has many people have clear ideas about exactly what we should do and what party we should form and how we should have party discipline. But maybe to bring this hopefully not completely boring monologue to its delightful conclusion, I think that there's a lot of questions that even those of us who have some fidelity to the horizontalist left need to really be asking ourselves at this moment, which sum up in, like, if we're not going to have a revolutionary party that is going to have a plan and a hierarchy and an effective method for seizing power, what else are we going to do? Like, realistically, beyond just like the rhetoric, which I have been part of generating over the last 20 years about how we need to revolutionize the nature of power from the ground up based on anarchist and feminist and horizontalist principles. Yeah, fine, Max, shut up. But like, really, when push comes to shove, in many of the situations that Bevans is pointing out, how are we going to actually either destroy the power of the kinds of people who are wielding power now, the sort of capitalist billionaire class? Like, how are we going to destroy their power, or how are we going to take power and do something different with it? And I return to a lot of the things that I, at one point in my life, distrusted and disliked about my parents' example in politics, you know, that discipline, that selflessness, sense of sacrifice. I don't think those things are not necessarily bad things, or I think their opposites can sometimes be worse these days. And I'm interested in what it means to actually think about commitment in a way that is not just about how we feel in the moment. I'm interested. I mean, obviously, everyone who's been in the class knows I'm pretty interested in like feelings and organizing through these things. But I also think that we need to also ask some tough questions about them at this point. And, you know, we need to have a criteria for assessing some of these categories that isn't just how they make us feel, essentially. That's my spicy take on it.
No,
But
I think that's right. And it's a question that you and I have been talking about a lot lately. And that I think there are some plans in the work for a project around, which is basically, should doing activism, in the broadest sense of activism, feel good? Like, should it make us feel good about ourselves? Should it make us feel happy? Should it make us feel like good at the end of the day? And I think I think that is the answer that I find when I go through that problem over and over again is very mixed. Because, well, for so many reasons, but I think partially because of this idea that it's work, I remember in the early days of running mutual aid network, which of course was completely unpaid always, and is still and should be perhaps, but it was like I was on the phone with old people about their grocery lists all the time. And I am happy that I did that, and I think it was a good thing to do. But like, did I feel elated when I got off the phone? No, it was work, right? And then of course there's all these other layers of activism. They're also often not very nice, like meetings and bureaucracy and people immediately falling out with each other. Which I think is a huge source of struggle for people who are trying to change the world. And I mean, I remember really early on, someone in our mutual aid group who worked for Facebook wanted us to use Workplace as the app by which to do mutual aid organizing. And that kind of was fine for a few weeks. And then Facebook did some new like spy thing. I can't remember which of the many spy things they launched during the pandemic. And then, like the sort of traditional lefties in the group lost their minds. And I mean that, not necessarily putting that response down. I just mean they were very upset. And they said like, absolutely not, we're not using this anymore. And I think we did leave it. We did leave Workplace. Anyway, the point is like these kinds of things that seem very small can completely derail groups, and in the end I think the person who created our mutual aid group left over this, even though he got his way. He was like too upset to keep going. He left. And I did not feel good then. And actually I would say like there were moments where we did really cool things and I felt good, but on the whole I experienced it as work, and yeah. And I think I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is I think along with work comes a couple of other difficult things. And I think they're difficult because they align with weird capitalist ideas, right? So there's like questions about like discipline.
Hmm.
There's questions about hierarchy, which a lot of people are very uncomfortable with and see as only a route to abuses of power. But I will say that like my experience of organizing has been that hierarchies are often a relief. Mainly because then you can get on with it without worrying that people are about to tell you no. But also because then things are distributed in a way that means you don't have to keep eyes over all of them all the time and be consulted about everything. Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of built-in questions here about like, is it work? Is it like capitalism? Is there a boss?
Hmm.
And I guess I want to maybe we should talk about the Jodi Dean reading a little bit.
Yeah.
Jodi Dean is, for anyone who doesn't already know her work, I would say like America's preeminent tanky, if we were gonna I don't know if she would want that as her term, but I would say she's one of the people in like American academia who is 100% committed to saying that she's a communist Marxist. And it's I think in like the Communist Party of America or something.
One of them.
One of
One of the many
many.
ones.
That
And just to point out, the word tanky is a kind of jokey, derogatory term
yeah,
for basically like Leninists. And it's said to refer to
statist
some
communists.
people who cheered on the tanks when they were sent into Budapest in the 1956 revolution that Stalin sent in to repress the democratic movement.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean,
it used to be an insult, and now all of my friends who are tankies are like, yeah, I'm a fucking tanky. So yeah.
yeah. Right. I don't know if she would identify as a tanky, but I would say that she defends the need for a state. She defends the need for in particular a move away from identity politics towards like a class-based organizing. And in particular, and you'll see in this writing, the need for a party. Which she really, really advocates for. And actually, this is not the only book where she does that. I can't remember the name of it right now, but I'm pretty sure there's another bit of writing that he has that's about literally just a history of the American Communist Party and what it meant to have a party for the people who were in it. And in particular, one of the things that she suggests is that the party is how you make intelligence collective.
Mhm.
Like on your own as an individual, you don't have that much insight necessarily, not only into what needs to happen, but also into how you yourself operate. And it is only by having other comrades who essentially hold you to account and tell you to get it together when you're doing it wrong, that you can grow as an activist. And for her, of course, there will be, maybe like hierarchies in the temporary sense that Max has now been made commissar of culture or whatever. But but the long and short of it is that it is by having a party that we have processes of accountability that are formal and therefore rigorous, and that there's something to belong to that we can get kicked out of, I think. I mean, and like, yeah, it almost is a shared project by its nature in that way. And I think a lot of people will object to this, and that's fine, by the way. You know, Max and I are not suggesting that anyone in this course should now absolutely agree with any one of these texts we discussed this week. But I do think that what really struck me in the readings this week, personally, is that bit in the reading you just mentioned about how he talked to loads of different activists who had done horizontal organizing, and none of them said that they wanted to become more horizontal or stay as, and most of them didn't want to stay as horizontal as they had been. They wanted to be less horizontal. And I think, you know, I think we should take that insight really seriously. I think the reality of experience must be a force for thinking, right?
No.
Practice has to be how we think as activists. Because at the end of the day, it's the outcome that we want, right? It's the actual progress in this world for people who are struggling and suffering. And if people who have been doing that work for a long time all think that too much horizontalism has impeded their work, then we should take that really seriously. And so, yeah, I was really struck by that. I mean, I almost wanted to hear every one of his interviews with every one of those people after that, or like, I just think, yeah, I'm very struck by that. And I just want to say one more thing about it, which is I think it also reflects our sort of pseudo-egalitarian media culture. And Jodie Dean talks about this too in a lot of her books, that we think we are living in like a horizontal world because anyone can have a Twitter account. But, so we can all say something, right? And like theoretically we could all go viral and become famous and become influencers and like become entrepreneurs and like be a billionaire, and we have this sort of theoretical setup where anyone could in theory become X or Y thing because we all have access to the theoretical point of entry. But in practice, of course, we are all wildly unequal, as we all are in capitalism, in fact. And, you know, the actual odds of us ever hitting this or that benchmark outside of the lowest level of achievement in any given area is very low. And she even points out that in communication networks like social media, mathematically, it kind of has to be that way for various reasons, because not everyone is connected to everyone. There are like small nodes within networks like that accumulate a huge number of connections, and everyone is tied into them. And that's actually just the nature of social media structures. So in short, it strikes me that we may have almost been hit by like to bring this back to the thing that's in the writings, that, you know, Lenin thought that we needed like a vanguard, because otherwise the sort of weakness of a vast part, like a vast group, is they will just absorb capitalist ideology and reproduce it, and they won't really have the kind of coherent, forceful pushing back against those norms needed to do good work. And I wonder a little bit if one of the things that has happened is actually that we've created a false idea of what horizontalism even is, so that we think that it's everyone has a point of entry and everyone can say their opinion, and without the deeper structures that would make those things meaningful anyway, within our own activist culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, to add two punctuations to that, I think like Lenin and Leninists are really interested in like the revolutionary moment, and Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely, who used to be Stokely Carmichael, we were thinking about including this video this week, makes a really great distinction that gets rehearsed many times between mobilizing and organizing. So we can mobilize people against injustice. And for Ture, that's not so hard. Like people see the injustice and they're like, fuck that, we're getting in the streets, we're going to get in the face of the people in power. But then he contrasts that to organizing, which is actually like, how do you build a kind of organization that has strength over time, and that when there's a mobilization and people are coming out in the streets or otherwise protesting against something, can be like, listen, everyone, here's how we're going to not just fight back in this context, but actually change the system generally. And, you know, for Lenin, that was clearly like a communist revolution, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. And I think that's the other thing that party gives you. And it goes back to what you were saying, Sarah, about like a party being a structure of kind of collective intelligence, as contrasted to our capitalist culture now, where we're all encouraged to be, you know, individual butterflies doing our own thing. It gives a space where within the party strategy can be debated, to go back to one of the terms that we introduced earlier in the course. Like a horizontalist organization or horizontalist movement can do tactics pretty well. Like we can get on the street, we can interrupt, we can have these tactics. But when we're actually talking about like a strategy, like how do all the tactics lead to a change, it's hard to gainsay how effective a party structure can be, especially when the party can also then provide a framework for analyzing how power works and what is the pressure point to poke at power so that it actually like changes and moves. And I guess I would just say that like a lot of what we've been talking about this course, because it's about mobilizing hearts and minds, has been about ideas and feelings. And I think the big provocation from this week that I would want us to dwell with is actually maybe ideas and feelings don't matter as much as organization. It's tough for us to deal with that, but like actually, and let me phrase it in the way that I like, maybe like my parents might have phrased it when they were young, which is like just like you're sitting around and talking about like how to change people's minds and hearts, but like without a revolutionary organization that actually is going to give people a way to contribute to like a revolutionary change in society, you're basically just doing entertainment. You're basically like going out there and like making people feel good or making them think different. They're like, they have a new thought. Great. They have a new thought about the system. Who cares? They don't do anything, right? They feel good about being in your movement. Who cares? They still drop out when, whatever, because they don't have the discipline. There's no structure around them. So like their argument, I'm ventriloquizing here and I'm making it unnecessarily extreme, for entirely Freudian reasons, I'm sure. Their sort of weird argument would be like, actually, none of it matters unless your movements are organized. And if they're organized around a strategy where you actually know what you want to do when you win and you have a plan to win. And I don't agree with that necessarily, but I like to pose it in the starkest, best terms from people that I know and I love, so that I have to face it. And I think we have to do it in this way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there's always the famous Marx line about how philosophers have previously interpreted the world, but the point is to change it, right? And I think essentially one of the questions here is, when we horizontally organize, do we end up having these quite profound effective experiences, but lacking either the longevity or the accountability that leads to like long-term changing the world, right? Now, of course, the limitation with almost all left-wing organizing is that very little changes the world, because that is what it means to be on the left. Often it means to be having less power and less resources and whatever, being oppressed. So
Yeah.
but I think there's an important question to be here. I think the other question really, and maybe this is a good way to like bring this back to where we want to discuss it in class this week, is okay, let's assume we take in at least some of this critique of horizontal organizing culture. In that case, it sounds like there needs to be a party, or something like a party, or maybe just some hierarchy within the organization that holds people to account, that some people are allowed to make decisions without a full consultation of everybody.
And without consensus. Yeah.
And without
consent.
Not everyone agrees. And some people are going to have to do things that they didn't actually think were great ideas, in order to remain an organization, right? And if that's true, then for me, the question is, what is the best way of organizing that, right? In a way, you get to questions about what could, for lack of a better word, be called democracy, but like the democracy of a bunch of people who are super motivated around a particular set of issues, which is even harder in my opinion. I think a lot of like democracy in quotes as we see it in our literal legal whatever voting systems functions in part because most people are not that motivated either way, and they just kind of go and check a box and like, yes, I'm part of this polis, thank you. But like democracy for activists is really hard because those people have opinions. Anyway, I mean, that's a whole other thing we could talk about another time. But I think the question then becomes, what is an okay version of accountability? What kinds of power structures are we willing to have in our lives that we have chosen to be a part of? And also, are we willing to sometimes just do things another way that we think is less good, right? And I do think this is one of the reasons why, even though it sounds very liberal, I think the themes of this course about talking to people we disagree with are actually important internally as well.
Mm.
That actually, I think a lot, as hard as it is for some of us to imagine talking to somebody who doesn't believe in X liberation or Y whatever thing, some of us might have a harder time imagining like working with a comrade we disagree with and doing it his way because four people thought that was a good idea. You know what I mean? I think that's just as hard. And yeah, so I think something that I'm curious about as we discuss it this week is what kinds of power structures we would consent to be parts of.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess like, you know, there's always this saying about parenting that like all the philosophical problems are contained within parenting, right? Because it's about like autonomy and like the point of life and what is a good life and meaning of life, blah blah. And I think there are some philosophical problems that are also contained within activism. Some spiritual problems almost about like humility and like kneeling to something bigger than yourself that I think are very dangerous when used in wrongly, as the case of Stalin obviously shows, but are also not things we can exempt ourselves from considering maybe. So anyway, I'm very curious what people are going to think and say about that.
Yeah. And just to add also the word sacrifice in here, like,
Sacrifice, yeah. Like
and
maybe your life is going to be harder
self-sacrifice.
or worse.
Yeah.
And that's so other people's lives can be better, you know? And I think another thing that I worry about as like a last thought that we can consider in classes, I think right now, a lot of the most there was basically a moment in like the 60s, for example, where because people were going to university, there was a whole group of people who, like, of course, they sort of had to write some essays eventually, but they had loads of free time. And it wasn't a huge sacrifice and might in some ways improve your quality of life to be part of an activist movement because you'd meet hotties and like smoke weed with them and read books. And that was great. And now I think that one of the problems that we're facing is that everyone is incredibly precarious and often are working jobs that are very intense already. And A, that already impedes their ability to do activism. And B, often it means that they then make activism their job. And then activism also becomes the thing that is like their whole meaning of their life. And they can't possibly bend to anyone else because it's their life, it's their whole life. Right. So I think there's something about the economic structures that have changed that make it difficult for us to imagine sacrificing in this area or like
Mhm.
giving up our career to do activism because in a way those things have become synonymous. So there's like a whole realm of interesting questions there, I think, about whether we're even in a world where people could imagine sacrificing for this kind of thing anymore frequently.
Yeah. I guess my hope for people preparing for the discussion is like probably most people in this course will fall a little bit closer on the horizontalist side, I imagine, from what people have already said. But I think those of us who do need to imagine the best argument for verticalism and then have a response. So I would be curious what people would think if they take a moment to meditate on it. Like, what is the best argument you can imagine for a rigid doctrinaire party approach from somebody who's as smart and as compassionate and as committed as you are? And then we have to judge our own tactics and strategies and approaches in light of that. Because otherwise, I think there's lots about the horizontalist approach that makes us feel good and righteous. And yeah, maybe, yeah, we need to put those things to the test.
Yeah, right. Maybe you had a cool time and all of your friends felt like equals and then nothing else was accomplished. Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a dinner party. And what does Mao say? He says the revolution is not a dinner party.
You can't pick and choose was the,
Okay.
yeah.
We are now canceled for reciting Mao. Anyway,
Well,
we're really excited to talk about this with all of you. We hope that you can find these ideas useful and in some way they transform the way you think about the work you do, even if you don't necessarily agree with the writers. And we hope that they will provide you with thoughts about how to do what you're doing more effectively.
yeah.
Yeah.
Great. We'll see everyone on Tuesday.
See you soon.